Okay. Well, thanks very much. And I really have loved Rochester a long, long time. I was telling Ann that I got a chance to lobby years ago for the Rochester Center, it was called, back then with the great and wonderful Dave Bishop. Dave was most of my career, I did two things. I wrote a political newsletter called Politics in Minnesota. Well, three things. I did that, and, well, fourth. Anyway, I did this newsletter, and it was so long ago, it was in the 80s. We didn't know we were supposed to make money, that we were supposed to, quote, monetize political news. All we knew is that we wanted to put out a newsletter and get it done so that at the end of the year we had enough money to go to Las Vegas once. And that seemed to us to be fine. And we gave it away to most people who got elected because those were the folks we wanted to think about what they were doing and, talk about it. Anyway, I did that, and I was a lobbyist. And one of the things that at the Capitol, and I got to choose basically because I was cantankerous, I got to choose the kind of stuff I wanted to do. And this group, the Rochester Center, asked me to lobby with them. And the wonderful Dave Bishop, who was chair from Rochester and chair of the bonding committee for a number of years, including the year that I did this, he was not happy to have them hire a lobbyist because he thought he could do it, and he was right. He could do it without me. So we worked it out, and Dave he was a wonderful, wonderful man. I just loved him dearly. He was one of the few legislators who actually had enough personal wealth to be able to pay for his own campaign, but he absolutely loved the system we used to have in Minnesota, the $50 deal, where if you gave 50 or 100 for a couple, you could get that money back from the state of Minnesota. And so he funded his campaign entirely with those kinds of contributions, and just thought it was a great thing. Used to kind of rail at me because he knew the Democrats had passed it, and he said, "See, you're just electing me," But anyway, this career of mine led eventually to this thing at the Metropolitan State University called the Masters in Advocacy and Political Leadership, and it's an attempt to train young people and not so young people who want to get a master's degree in this era of everybody seems to have one, who want to get a degree in the business of making policy, changing it, making us do the kinds of things we want to do. And so I agreed with Ann to talk about this subject, and realized afterwards that I'd taken on a few too many bites out of the apple here, because we kind of said three things. One, that Minnesota has always been thought of as a wonderfully governed place. And I thought, gosh, I'm going to need to prove that a little bit. And then secondly, we had this reality that we were some kind of special place. The media recognized it, and it was really true. And as a matter of fact, that we were going to be able, or maybe not able, to continue being that way after this election. And that's really kind of three subjects. So I'm apologizing for crowding this up too much, but we'll try to take them in that order. And the first then is are we really the place that the media around the country says is wonderful? Well, this quote just happened recently in July of this year. Now, it was leading up to a story about bad stories about Minnesota around the subject of a disparity between people of color and the white population relative to education, graduation rates, all those kinds of things. So this was kind of a backward compliment in a way, but he's right. We were thought of in this way. And some of you in this room are at least probably 20 years younger than me, but still will remember some of the things that happened in the media in the old days. You won't remember the first one here, but there was this publication, the American Mercury, and this was one of the original kind of stories in political in political journalism that kind of began to look at the way states are governed and the way they do things, and Minnesota came up as kind of the paragon of virtue in 1890. Inside USA was a book and published in a couple of different ways over the period of the 40s and 50s, and Minnesota always sort of led the trail there. You all may, some of you remember Wendy and the walleye. I talked to Governor Anderson a number of times, and he never would admit whether he actually caught that walleye. I think the truth is he didn't, but he did know how to catch them. In '73, Neil Pierce led a whole kind of thing around the thinking about states, thinking about how they're run. And again, Minnesota was and The Economist did this big takeout on us in '97 from now a European perspective. And again, it just says, wow, these folks really get it right. So it's kind of like, okay, we did good PR somehow. Everybody seemed to think it was the thing, and I'm doing this lobbying and writing this newsletter, doing stuff, and then I finally decided I was going to go teach. And so you obviously need more education. I had a master's degree, but I needed to go to the university and get my PhD, which never did get finished, but someday. But anyway, so, and I encountered at the university and eventually ended up writing this book, which is the last kind of take on Minnesota political life from the more classic political science-y kind of take, a full, here's what Minnesota is, called Minnesota Politics and Government. I ended up meeting Dan Elazar. And Dan was famous in those days for creating this new thing, at least in political science circles. This is now 50s, 60s, 70s, that he began to think this up. And what it said essentially was the states are different in the way their political cultures generate their their lives, the way they act, that those cultures, you can look at a state like Illinois, and you can see certain things about it that, are different than a state like Utah, for example. And so Dan's theory, and I'll go through this quickly because it struck me so hard when I got to the university in the late 80s to study political science, PhD student, and I just, whoa, this guy's right about us, about the way we are. So Dan says there are three kinds of states: individualistic, traditionalistic, and moralistic. Now, the individualistic culture, the dominant one in the U.S., it emphasizes the democratic order as a marketplace in which government is instituted for utilitarian reasons. You don't do government because you're trying to do good. You do government to kind of keep everybody at peace, to stop too much fighting. And the characteristics of the individualistic, and as I say, this is the dominant political culture in the United States. Politics is a way to improve yourself, socially, economically. States like Illinois, for example, like New York, had a fairly strong party discipline, regularity. You didn't, once you were on the team, you stayed on the team, or the team would bump you out. It was rooted in personal relationships. Citizens were not expected to play much. Basically, in the individualistic culture, it was a professional game. It's the game for people who really get into it and love it, and they kind of run the voting, run the table. Politics is dirty to most people, and it should be left to the professionals. One of the really fascinating things, I'll never forget this. So corruption's okay in an individualistic state. It's very common, matter of fact. And I'm from Minnesota. And as I'll talk about that in a second with the moralistic, we just don't do corruption very well here. We just don't get it right. And so this is like maybe 1990. I'm in Chicago talking to this reporter, and he opens up his desk door and he says, we were talking about corruption, and he said, see this? I said, yeah. I said, well, that's my list of stuff that I know is going on that involves corruption. But he said, and he had like 12 files in there. And he said, the truth is I can't really follow them unless they get over $1 million, because it's just too much, Now, as you may know, the last 5 governors of Illinois have either gone to jail or been indicted. So it's not a really uncommon thing for them to, and so corruption it's what happens in that system. It's, new programs should be enacted only when there's a real strong demand. You use the spoil system. In other words, your cousin having a job is better than a better qualified person having a job. Those are just the rules. And as I say, that's now the traditionalistic culture comes basically from the South. It's rooted in this ambivalent attitude toward the marketplace. Yeah, we got to have business, but the place, the system ought to be run by the elites, by the folks in charge, by the ones who really know and have inherited the genes to do this right. The traditionalistic culture, and I'll give you the good cheat sheet on this, which I didn't have for a few times when I read about this, and Dan finally admitted, yeah, an awful lot of this is based on the fact that they're trying to keep black people out of the system. That's the point. And so when you have a traditionalistic culture, the tradition is in the American South, the tradition was basically only the black folks are supposed to, the black folks are not supposed to play. You know, it's those of us who kind of have run things for a long time who should keep doing it. And all of this, by the way, and one of the things my students have to put up with is all these weird aphorisms that I do, and one is love your doubt, and the other is it has something to do with confusion is okay, and subtlety is okay, because there are no 100% answers in politics, ever, and just as you will find in the American South, incredibly strong civil rights groups with great outreach and effectiveness. I mean, all of this is, I'm overcharacterizing, obviously, or I'm characterizing a very large and complex system. So society is hierarchical. Government's role is to maintain the existing social order. No expectation of citizen participation. As a matter of fact, in the South, for a very long period of time, there was a fairly significant effort to make sure that some people didn't get to participate. And as a matter of fact, we're seeing that again. Basically, what's happening is under something described as preventing voter fraud, we're getting a whole series of things put back in place now that the courts have ruled that the Voting Rights Act doesn't have individual expectations for states anymore. Now that that's the case, we're off to the races in trying to make sure that, again, that black folks won't be voting very much. And as a matter of fact, they're probably on the order of 2 million or so who will be not voting this time because of those new rules. There's no expectation of citizen participation. In matter of fact, to this day, it's a little bit sort of frowned upon. You know, you're really supposed to know what the right answer is before you go to the polls. And parties are generally not important. It's this kind of clan feeling that's running the place. And so the South, as you know it, after the Civil War, was entirely Democratic, even though its adherents, the senators and so forth, were more conservative by quite a bit, and more, let's say, not in love with civil rights than the Democrats were. You know, and that went on for a long time. Then we switched. But whichever way it is, in the South, generally speaking, it's one party or the other. Okay. Now we come to Minnesota. And the Commonwealth, this is a concept that Eleazar had that was very important to him. It's a feeling, and for those of you who are familiar at all with biblical writing and references, the Commonwealth is this sort of spiritual almost thing that exists, that people belong to, and I want you to look at this second sentence. Well, we'll get back to it. Politics considered one of the great activities of humanity in its search for the good society. That's what Eleazar said about states like, and spoiler alert, Minnesota is the most, in his schema, Minnesota was the most moralistic of all the states. It was far and away the one that acted in this way. And he felt that, well, he had a number of reasons for that. But now the characteristics of the moralistic society. There's an acceptance of the use of communal and government resources to achieve common good. Dan used to say that, he'd tell me that one of the things that happened in Minnesota was first a bunch of Easterners, came out here, and we're talking now non-native, right? So white people. So and then everybody began to try to build up the population. And there was a lot of advertising that happened in Europe and Germany particularly, and as that went on, he sort of went through all of this stuff and noted that everybody kind of forgot to mention what the weather was like and how difficult it could be. And so he claims that when people got here and they'd get a small community together and they'd, how are we going to survive this? Well, you do it together. You have to. It's the only way you can. And he maintained that that's what gave Minnesota its tradition of, okay. I remember first encountering this, and there's a book that every state does. It's essentially called State-Owned Enterprises. It's the things that states do that are kind of like businesses, but that they own. And by a factor of 2.5 to 1, Minnesota has more of these things than any other state. Now, ours is driven up a little because governments, for example, own liquor stores in Minnesota. It's and it was something that was done after Prohibition was gone, and people didn't know quite what to do, and they were a little bit worried about having either the bar owners or they wanted some independent thing to run the thing. They were worried. And so, and it's not uncommon. I mean, it happened all over the country, but here it happened a lot. But Minnesotans own, the counties own nursing homes and hospitals and even restaurants in some small town, number of small towns actually in Minnesota over the years have put in a restaurant just because there wasn't any other, and the county or the city council would sort of say, you know what, you can't have a town without a restaurant, for God's sakes. So we better do it. So that spirit kind of played itself out in Minnesota. Another characteristic, it's issue-based, not relationship-based. And a great deal of that, Dan maintains, is because of Minnesota's founding right after the Civil War. or right during that period. And we were an anti-slavery state. And that, the first governor elected in Minnesota, Alexander Ramsey, pretty clearly cheated to get the job, or at least his supporters did. And he was a Democrat. And the reason we say he cheated is that the guy, there was a precinct up in the northwestern part of the state that voted like 92 to 18 for a Republican for something kind of 2 years before, and then when the ballots got to St. Paul, magically he was 100 to nothing for the Democrat. And some people thought maybe there was a little skullduggery going on there. But anyway, since that Democrat was elected, there were no more until the end of the century. Republicans always won, and the reason was that the Republicans were the party of Abraham Lincoln, the party that was against slavery, and that issue was so important to Minnesota that it just overran everything.
When was that? Would that be in the 1850s you're talking about?
That started in 1850, you're right, 1858, 8, and then on the way. And parties can be abandoned in Minnesota. And we have a number of issues, examples of that. The most recent one is Norm Coleman, who was mayor of St. Paul. And I'll tell you a funny story about that. So I'm writing a newsletter. Norm is mayor of St. Paul. He's a Democrat, right? And he calls me and my partner over one day, and we sit down and have breakfast with him. And he tells us that he's going to switch parties because he wants to run for governor. And he has basically, in those days, the kind of the biggest issue of all was abortion. And Norm was married to sort of the princess of the anti-abortion family in Minnesota, and he just couldn't do it. Shouldn't have. I mean, his personal life would have been a mess. So he was going to change. And the waitress, who's a wonderful character, Pegster, she comes over, and she's been eavesdropping on the whole thing, of course. And this downtowner, all the political types in St. Paul hung out there. She comes over, slams her bill on the table and says, "So Norm, if you're a Republican, can you still be a Jew?" Which was a very sensible question in those days, because the incidence of Jewish Republicans was very, very small. Anyway, so we just don't worry that much about. No, he just laughed. Parties can be abandoned easily for a larger cause. And so in the early years of my lobbying at the legislature, we never had party votes to speak of. You'd maybe get 3 in a whole session, where the caucus parties, the Republicans or the Democrats, would get together and say, this is our official line and we want everybody to try to stay with us. They didn't necessarily, but that only happened a few times a year. Now, of course, almost every vote is that way. And perhaps most importantly, citizens are expected to participate and to control the system. And the citizen in a moralistic culture is the god of the system. Supposed to be. there's little tolerance for corruption, and as I mentioned, we just don't do it very well. We had a alderman up in Minneapolis who got the park board once to fix his house, and it was a huge scandal, and he went to jail. I mean, and we just don't have it. Communitarianism, the sense of the government can do things, it's okay if you need it, that tends to favor local government intervention, and we have quite a bit of that in the state. And there tends to be a very strong feeling about you're not allowed to hire your nephew if he isn't better than any other candidate. Now go back to that. One of the great activities, we used to say, you're going to have a real political scientist next time, Catherine Pearson. I mean, she is a big deal, and astoundingly smart woman. But anyway, so political scientists generally have a definition of politics, right? I mean, they've spent hundreds of years coming up with definitions. And the most common one is politics is who gets what, when, where, and how. And in my program, our students are a little bit taken aback by, we give them a new definition of politics. Politics is how we care for each other. This is how we do it in a society. And if we can't figure out how to do this, then we're going to have a real problem. So, my question is, it's kind of we sort of proved that Minnesota, I think, did some things right. It was these things, and then now we've got this. Is this a search for the good of society? Well, I guess I'll leave it to you to decide between the candidates, and and we can talk about that later if you want. But I'm going to offer a number of reasons why I think we'll survive this, and it's not pretty. It's and a lot of things have happened in Minnesota that have led us down some bad paths. But I think in the end we are doing better than the rest of the states, and there are some complex reasons for that. One, the word intermediaries. In Minnesota, we have had a tradition of allowing some political power to accede to people in the middle, party officers, caucuses, groups, interest groups like ARC, Association for Retarded Citizens, which doesn't call itself that anymore because they're not supposed to. But, those groups in this state are really quite powerful and have a lot to say about the policy. Those intermediaries have a tendency, I think, to be moderate in their views because they're arguing against people who disagree with them, and as a consequence, there's a lot of back and forth that goes on. When you don't have intermediaries, as we did not in this last election, in the, certainly on the Republican primary, it was basically skip over the intermediaries and go right to the public. That's when you get, I think, that's when you get a Trump. Because the intermediaries have a tendency to not like that. And here, as a matter of fact, Minnesota was one of the few places, because our intermediaries, these guys in the middle, gals, guys, ran the caucus system, he did not win here. Matter of fact, he came in third. And it's the only state where that happened to him. And it's because we had that we depend on those kind of people. And I think we're going to continue to do that. In Minnesota right now, if you are in the legislature, there's, I believe it's, well, I don't know this right now, somewhere around 90 to 98% chance that you will have been endorsed by a political party prior to your election. That's just the way we do it here. Now, in a number of states, they don't do it. And in other states, they do that, but they put that on the ballot. You know, so it says, Joe Blow is the endorsed Republican candidate. We don't say that. You know, all you get out of that is the support of the party and the hope that that's good enough to get you through the primary. But it matters. It matters a great deal. Rochester is perhaps more kind of back and forth than most areas in the state. But essentially there's this, in Minneapolis, if you're not endorsed by the DFL party, don't bother running. It ain't going to happen. And people often, and I'm sure some of you will say, oh, that's terrible. You know, you know who else are your intermediaries? Lobbyists. And people say, oh, you got to get those terrible people out of there. It's awful. Except that, I used to be one, so, you know, I argue for them. But it's the only way that I know of that you can begin to have some sort of reasonable discussion, some sort of yes, but, as opposed to it's this way or go away. And that, of course, more and more is what's happening in most states, is that we've got enough of the problem, but wow, in many places it's just impossible to get anything done. I just saw a piece in the Strib yesterday, day before, about we've done bad things with transportation finance. You know, we just have not done it well, and the system is going in the tank slowly but surely. We got to spend more money at it. Period. And at least finally we're now agreed, Republicans and Democrats are agreed that something has to happen. Now the question is, where does the money come from? Republicans don't want to use taxes for it. They want to do borrowing. At least we can agree on a goal. Now all we have to do is, you know, agree on the means, which is not that easy. Campaign finance. This country has moved very significantly in the past 25 years to an oligarchy. Our campaigns, more and more, are being run by and dominated by people who have lots and lots of money. And this was particularly interesting to me because this book, I remember a few things I've written, but I always remember this sentence. It's the sentence that begins the chapter on on campaign finance in Minnesota. And the sentence is, if money is the mother's milk of politics, then Minnesota has the lowest fat milk in the country. Now that sentence was written at the beginning of 1999. And about 4 months later, court did another ruling on campaign finance. And of course, Citizens United came later and the others. And so the whole game changed. We had in 1999 a system that Dave Bishop used to take advantage of, where if you ran for the House, you could spend $20,000, period. That was the end of it. And there were fairly strict limits on how much people could give you and that kind of thing. For the senators, it was literally, it was twice that, 40,000, because they served 2 House districts. And people went out, the candidates raised their own money. There was nobody throwing dollars in from hither and yon. And the candidates ran their own campaigns. And they decided what the issues would be. We don't have that anymore. And it is very, very scary because other people are now setting the agenda. You don't get to, unless you're extraordinarily sophisticated observer, there's just no way for you to tell what the candidate thinks about the messages being spent for him or her. So this is supposed to be free speech. I guess it is, but to me it seems to be more the only speech that's free is the speech that money can buy. The idea that we can't control that so that candidates can talk to us and say, this is what we should do together. Now, having said all that, we're still closer to that in spirit and in Minnesota than almost any other state. Candidates still think they're supposed to have a say in what the campaign does. Candidates still tell the PACs and outside groups to go away periodically. It happens a lot more than I was even aware of. And so that we're closer to the old ideal than almost anybody else is. I just think, I have to believe, because in the current trajectory, the country really has a lot of trouble until we get to a point where a court will reverse Citizens United and the track that it created. I can't imagine how we do this as a democracy, because we now have, people who sit like guy in Las Vegas who sits and holds court and listens to 5 or 6 candidates and then says, okay, we're supporting you and you and you. We're not supposed to do it that way, I don't think. We have a participation tradition of the last 6 presidential elections. Minnesota has had the most voters 5 times and came in second once. Now, part of that, and part of the reason the state is not nearly as democratic as many Republicans tend to think it is, because in the early stretches, there were a lot of Minnesotans on the ballot, Humphrey and Mondale, and so that has a tendency to sort of drag the party thing up and participation up. But we've kept it. It is simply, in this state, the right thing to do to vote. It's what you're supposed to do. We kind of all know that. It's in our water. And as a consequence, that plus the intermediaries, because just voting is great, and that says something about the whole citizenry, but you really have to spread out how the policies get done and made and figured out. And that's what those intermediaries do. This, right here, this is an example of a participation tradition. There are a lot of places where this kind of, and maybe after you hear me, it'll end here. But there are a lot of places where this is simply not done. That people just, because they're interested, because they're citizens, because they care. And that's part of our DNA. So that tradition is helpful. And we have a practicality tradition. There's more and more, and I can see this at the legislature particularly, where we go through a phase where you get some folks in there who think we ought to just do away with all of it, the whole government, and let's just blow it all up. And then others come in and say, we've got to have the schools. Come on. I once, the most shocking thing that ever happened to me over there one time, I came across a group of 4 legislators who had just been elected, and they were holding a little discussion group that they did apparently every week on whether or not we really had to have free public education. And happily, by the end of the session, they had been disabused of the notion that paying for education by the state was not a good thing to do. And that's what intermediarying does to you, And it's not all politics. It's politics in the sense of who wins the election. It's a lot of things. And I will put in a final pitch for my, and here Dr. Pearson will disagree with me, as most political scientists do. But I've gotten involved in the ranked choice voting argument. This is a system that's used in Minnesota in our 2 largest cities. And it basically, people have a tendency to talk about it in sort of complicated ways, but you assume that there's more than one person running for something, like there's maybe even more than 2, like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever, and you just rank them. You say, I want that one number 1, I want that one number 2, and I want this one number 3. And the thing I like about this, there's a lot, but there's one piece. I used to, when I did talks years ago, I used to tell people, and it was funny back then, it's not funny anymore, because back then you used to say, all I learned from about politics, all I needed to know about politics, I learned from a New Yorker cartoon in 1938 or something like that. I mean, I didn't read the cartoon, but saw it. And it's 2, what would have been called then little old ladies. My wife won't let me say that anymore. But 2 older women headed to the voting booth, kind of glinty-eyed, looking at each other. And one says to the other one, who are you going to vote against? Well, unfortunately, now That's kind of a normal question. As a matter of fact, this election is encapsulating that feeling. Who are you going to vote against? But one of the things that ranked choice voting does is to simply say, that's not the question. The question is, who do you think can do the job better? Whoa, does that change everything. When you don't have mano a mano, when you're not doing this, but you're saying, who do I want to do this better? It's possible to begin to think about things besides which one do I want to shoot, which really is kind of what's been happening a lot to us. And we have this in 2 cities. I think it'll spread. There's a state now, I believe it's New Hampshire, that's going to try ranked choice voting on state elections. There are some other things that, I have been fairly close to many of the, leaders from both parties, frankly, but DFL leaders particularly in the past few years, and they all just come at you with hammer and tongs. Don't you know this is going to create other parties, yeah, you bet. I hope it does. Because, not that I want mass chaos, but I do want the opportunity for people to start thinking about this in terms that are positive rather than it's always beat the other guy and beat him hard. So, that's my summary. So we do better than the rest because we still have a lot of participants. We still try this really hard. And asking, just doing this on the cheap, which is, I think, what we've been doing, is just saying, all that stuff is so complicated. Just ask people, what do they want? Well, that doesn't always give you a really good answer. There's administration involved in, it'd be like telling the chancellor, we're going to vote on the courses that get offered at this school. Because, but there should be a fair amount of discussion and thought and research and, before you just jump on one or the other. I just got back from California, and, they do the initiative and referendum, and there are 56 this time. So, and I happen to be in Sacramento, so the Sacramento Bee opened it up, and there's 2 full pages in the middle of the various, just the language around these. I don't know. I think I'd have trouble.
Question.
Yes, sir.
Well, what about third-party votes?
Third-party votes in this election?
Yeah.
Well, they're going to be wasted, but I think it's a way to say, wasted is a way that political scientists and others say the only thing is to win. I don't think that's a waste at all. And there's a guy by the name of Evan McMullen, thank you, in Utah particularly. He's running in a number of states, and I believe he's on the ballot here. But he is a person who will, and It's very strange, but it's possible that he could be president. There's like a 0.5% chance that he could be president, because if he wins in Utah and gets enough votes, gets some votes in the Electoral College, and neither Hillary nor Trump win enough votes to actually win the election, then the election goes to the House of Representatives. And the House is pretty certain they don't like almost anything right now. I mean, it's theoretically possible that this guy, because he's in the Electoral College, they could all switch their votes and vote for him and make him president, which would be a pretty fascinating thing. But I think in this election we're going to see a lot of third-party votes, and it's a way to say no thanks. Now, we did it in Minnesota. There's no question that Jesse Ventura was a stand-in for the vote none of the above. Both of the candidates were not appealing to people, and his ads were, I had to go through that administration, and I happen to think he was a terrible governor, but that doesn't matter. He was able to win because he was able to say, these clowns, are you kidding? Come on. Now, if we could do that nationally, I think that's exactly what would happen, but we can't, because of the structure of the election is so complicated.
Two things. On the referendum which you mentioned, I worked as a judge of the elections in Illinois,
Oh, yeah?
and most people just don't have the time to complete their ballots.
Huh.
In other words, they'll leave those unmarked, unless there's one in particular, and they'll come in with the number. So in other words, they don't read all the referendums, they'll come in and they'll just vote for that one particular
Yeah,
number.
right.
They just can't take the time
Right.
to do that. And then the other thing is, you mentioned that Utah is looking at the independent voters. I talked today, and they said Nevada is also really very high for the independent.
Oh, really? That'd be interesting. If he really got, what would that be, 6, 7, 8 electoral votes? That'd be fascinating. Yes, sir?
You talked a little bit about Citizens United.
Uh-huh.
What was the motivation of the court to overturn that, to allow the essentially $1, one vote sort of thing that happened out of that? It doesn't seem to fit into, they didn't seem to have to be influenced by money to the court to make that rule.
No, and if you lay it down, and believe me, this is the most painful exercise, which I've almost finished, but not quite. But if you start the decision trail that starts, I can't think of the name of the first one. It was 82, I think. There's a trail of decisions around speech and who gets to say it and who gets to control it, that sort of thing. And I think they just simply allowed that kind of construct reasoning to just keep chugging along until they got to the end and said, there, see, it makes sense. Well, no, it doesn't. But, at least to me, it doesn't. But you can lay out sort of like diagramming a sentence, you can put down the subject and the verb and all that kind of stuff, and at the end the sentence still doesn't say anything. well, in this case, it does say something awful, I think. But the very idea that, what I really was kind of intrigued the most about, one of the things about that we don't appreciate as much about the constitutional period in this country, the founding period, was anti-corporation. I mean, universally, the founders were all kinds of writings around the idea that creating these permanent things that lived beyond people was just a bad idea. It shouldn't be done, you know? And to then say, you know, have the court many years later say, oh no, they are people. That's the point. You know, the founders would have turned over in their graves. And the other was inherited wealth and keeping that, you know, primogeniture and that sort of thing in England was a very strong driving force in the whole feeling of putting this Constitution together, so that all the second and third and fourth sons still was only boys, but they couldn't inherit over there, and they didn't like that. So the whole idea that the founders would have loved, or would have felt that estate tax was evil. Again, I think there wasn't any evidence of that.
And a question in regard to Citizen United, would that fit in under the individualistic or under the traditionalist perspective of government? How would you define that? It's corrupt and it's also hierarchical.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess I never thought of it that way. And that's a good point from the standpoint of Dan always thought about states as opposed to the national government, and and so his scheme was always about how things played out there, and he didn't write very much about the national thing. And as a matter of fact, later in life, he took a joint appointment with Bar Ilan University in Jerusalem, and was perhaps the principal advisor, apparently, for about 4 or 5 years to Bibi Netanyahu. So he was a really conservative guy who thought a lot about the Commonwealth, you know, how we do things together. And I think one of the reasons that he and Netanyahu got along is that to Dan, you know, and I was never a Netanyahu fan, but to Dan, the whole idea that God was involved somehow in the covenant with the Jewish people about that land, that was real in his mind. You know, that was no kidding real. And so he could say, as a political thing, you bet, we're going to, you know, we were here before the Palestinians, God gave us to us, and we ought to stay, and they ought to go, or something. You know, which makes the whole, it just puts a different, for me, it put a different sort of face on the whole discussion in that area, which is, you know, still extremely difficult and complicated area. But there's no question that the Jewish state has become more and more fundamentalist in its religious beliefs. You know, they are growing very rapidly with the Hasidic folks, and they're growing much less rapidly with anything like what we're accustomed to in this country, which is secular Jews, who basically, you know, believe in the traditions, etc., but don't do the very, I guess you'd say, traditional sorts of things. So it's a real, and frankly, I'm married to a Jew, and so, and I get to listen to her family as they discuss these things, and they're very, very bright and involved people with varying takes on what Israel ought to do. So I'm more attuned to it than most people, I think, usually are. Yes, sir?
This election's all about the Supreme Court, so
Yeah. Well,
if Hillary gets elected, can they not appoint any member to the court?
yeah, that's actually just in the past week that has become, the question was, can if Hillary is elected, and I assume I can add, and if the Senate continues to be held by Republicans, can they simply not support any of her nominees? And as a matter of fact, Senator McCain said just 2 days ago, that's exactly what they're going to do. They'll just not take any nominees because they know that any nominee she gives them will not be acceptable. So they'll just wait until,
That's 5 years,
right,
at minimum.
right. And it's I find it to be, and it's not a crime to do that,
But there's 4-4, they don't get nothing done.
right? It's not a crime, and it's not constitutionally not permitted. I mean, the way the Constitution is worded, the president must offer names, and the Senate must advise and consent, except, I mean, and somebody can take the job only if they have received the advice and consent of the Senate, in other words, approval. But the bottom line is, they don't have to act. There's nothing to make them do that. And the theory is, you let the numbers drop then. And I think the theory is also that who's going to die next are probably a Democrat, or one of the Democratic side. And so then you're back to being, I find that really shocking. And I think the public might too, in the end, just to say, although, gosh, there have been so many things said this time that I said, no way, And then, as my kids would say, yeah, way, watch. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, Representative Ellison was down here a couple nights ago at the DFL thing. He had a point that I had never heard before. He said, and my numbers may be wrong, but he said, I have 110,000 people in my district casting ballots. And of course, the districts are all uniform.
Right.
You said he's got some other members in the House that have 25,000 votes cast for them in any given election. And he said that's why those people they don't have to get reelected. They're just sort of acclamation. They just show up and they're reelected.
Representative Ellison has done a marvelous job, frankly, in a piece of Minnesota tradition, I think, and that is bringing up the turnout, constantly bringing up the turnout. And he's started this, oh gosh, it's got to be 3 cycles ago, I think. But, you know, he's not going to lose. He's in a district that, well, even in this election, I won't use some of the things we used to say about what you're going to have to be caught doing in order to lose that election. But he just isn't going to lose. So he could just coast. And he has done a marvelous job of not only getting turnout up in his own race, thus the 110,000, because in those other districts, they're just not, they don't need to, they don't care. You know, if you're going to win anyway, why turn out? Well, because it's the Minnesota style, because the more that people participate, the more they can make the system do what they think it ought to do. That's, you know, and that's what we really want. We want as many people as possible to keep saying, I do my way. Now, that's not the same as everybody's way, but the more we get that, the better off we are. And Keith has just committed to that. And now he goes all over the country, actually, doing that same work. And, yeah, he's the champion of turnout.
The district where Nolan and Mills are running, they're going to spend over $12 million on
Yep.
this race.
Yep.
Why should that be bought like that?
Well, that's the new, and you know, and I'm so old now that I can go back to a different time and tell you that, man, I used to be in the room when somebody would want to run like for Congress, and because of the newsletter that I did and almanac, and you know, they'd get me to come in and, you know, what should we do? Well, it's always fun, but then they'd say, okay, what are we going to run on? And sure, you do polling, but you got a chance to ask a candidate, well, what do you think? What would you like to have happen? What will make us better? What do people in your district, you know? Now, it's a pretty simple operation. It's all about, you get the numbers to have the person in Washington. And if the same Norm Coleman I was talking about is just put in another $2 million in that race. He's running the Koch brothers operation here in Minnesota. And so they just decide that it's possible. This guy Mills might win. And so you throw the money in there. And the part that's hard, I think, and the reason I think we've got to fix this eventually, I did this the other day, I was getting my hair cut, and both of them. And the barber had, the new ads were now on from the 8th up in the northern suburban areas where the district comes pretty far south now. So they're buying Twin Cities TV. And so it's this daytime show, I don't even know what it was, but it's just wall-to-wall ads. And you look at it, that's what the $12 million's for. And if you were dropped in from Mars or heck, from any place. You look at that and say, God, these are despicable people. They're just awful. If you listen to those ads, describe how awful those people are. Why would you want your kid to do that? To be a congressman? And I was involved with, before Rick ran, and Rick, of course, I'd known him the first time around. He was a congressman. Fun kid, and then he left, right? Didn't have to, he just left. And went into business, did some other stuff, and then started thinking about coming back after Jim died, Jim Oberstar. And it really was, in the beginning, kind of almost, holy cow. Now, there were two young men up in that district that they could have had the seat. They could. One was the mayor of Duluth, Don Ness, and the other was Tony Sertich, who was minority leader of the Minnesota House. And they just both, I mean, we used to weep for candidates like that 25 years ago. And now both of them look at you and say, why would I do that? I mean, the game used to be that you could move the entire family to Washington and so have a family life while you were a member of Congress, and you'd come back here periodically. Now everybody has to live here. They have to stay here. You've got to keep your kids here. I don't want to keep my kids away from me. What kind of life is that? Plus, you don't get paid enough to actually have two houses. So, you know, I mean, these days they're what? The last number I saw was, I think, 12 members of Congress who don't have rooms. They sleep in their offices from Tuesday to Thursday and then just go back home. Really? Is that what we want? You know, that kind of, I mean, that's sort of asking for bad decisions, seems to me. But, you know, I mean, I don't know if, I'm sort of perhaps just constitutionally done this way, but I think it's when you try too hard and have too many things on your plate and you start to make mistakes, you know, and I just, sleeping on a couch is, for weeks on end, that's not what I want my congressman doing. But it's nuts. And